have been done in the past. So we'll just start with talking about what we've done, and this is on coming up with documentation standards, and trying, again, standards being sort of a dirty word inside of open source, but having a standards per se. I'm going to share a screen here. I just want to, back last year, we had started a group called the Documentation Evangelist Committee. And we had a couple of meetings. We had some good input. One of the things that we had developed, and I asked for feedback and hadn't seen anything yet, but I want to make people aware of it, is we had said, let's have some wiki guidelines. And so I put together a quick page. It's I'll make sure that it's available for everybody to go look at. And we just said, if we're going to do a wiki, there's different types of documents that we need to create. Some of them the wiki serves very well for. Excuse me. And so, again, we came up with, here's some guidelines. A straw man of guidelines. We'd really like to have people come back with suggestions on how they think this could be updated. And then let me go from here to just try this. And this is a presentation that we had put together last year. Darn it, I'm on the wrong page. Here we go. So I'm just recycling a presentation from before. So we did want to, again, I'm not going to spend that 15 minutes reviewing the wiki guidelines. I'd ask everybody to go look at it. And there are meeting minutes in that same area. So what I'd really like to do is just focus around what we should be thinking about in regard to our documentation for the community as a whole. Do we last year we had said we should be thinking in terms of recommendations for the web pages for the projects and for the blogs. We want to talk about harmonizing the tooling and what the priorities were. And let me move to the next slide here. Actually, that's the end. That's where I wanted to get started from today, is what are the thoughts and considerations. So what I wanted to do is ask people to start sharing their ideas today. Let me actually bring the presentation over so I can work on it. And I think I just want to start with, what are the things that we should consider? And I'd like to go back to earlier conversations about documentation that we were having today when Gergely was talking. I know that someone said, and I've heard multiple times, that the ONAC community has quite a bit of standardization around their documentation. So I wanted to start asking people, what do you all think we need to do in order to get closer to first, is it even reasonable for us to expect that we would have a common look and feel across the documentation that we create as LFN, not just ONAP, ANIKIT, FIDO, all the other groups? Could we be looking at a more standardized level of documentation? And this is going to be a very interactive conversation, so I'll start calling on people if I don't get responses. So, thoughts? Who do we have from ONAP?
As Scott.
Yes, sir.
Yes, David.
David.
So just from a release management perspective, I've been working with documentation as part of the release management process.
Yep.
For about 7 years within LF, and two things stand out to me. One is that is to include multiple checkpoints on the documentation within the release management process from very early on. So what I've seen is a lot of release management, they're focused on hitting code related
Mhm.
checkpoints, passing testing and so on. And then, toward the end of the release process, they'll have an item that says, complete documentation. And that's the only thing that speaks to documentation in the entire release process. And so what I've found that's helpful to result in better documentation is that you actually include, multiple checkpoints from, the midpoint, if not sooner, in the release process, all the
Mhm.
way to the end. And that does a couple of things that makes sure that you get the teams thinking about their documentation earlier on instead of right at the end. And then the other thing that might be less obvious is that it really helps out the your documentation team. So recently, or the last, I don't know, year and a half or so, we have some members from Deutsche Telekom that have kind of stepped in on ONAP documentation and have done a fabulous job.
Mm.
And I've met with them quite a bit, and one of their frustrations is that it's difficult for them to push the quality of the documentation forward without having checkpoints in the release process that support what their objectives in improving the documentation.
So if I understood what you said, David, you're saying that the quality of the doc is improved because if we ask for documentation work to be done earlier in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of just having one
Right.
checkpoint, at
Right.
the end of the process that says, finish documentation.
Okay.
Break it down into a finer set of checkpoints that specifically are meaningful to your documentation team, and insert those into the process.
Okay. So basically, not waiting till the last minute lets us have a higher quality of material produced.
Right.
Even if we're creating something at the beginning that is going to change, we're not starting from scratch and having a couple of days to figure it out.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's one thing. The other thing too that I've run into over and over again is that frequently we end up as part of our CI process, our documentation build, is part of that CI process. And people, particularly if it's a new project or someone that's delivering a new document, being unable to do a local build of the documentation because the tool chain is so complex. If you're producing documentation for a project for the first time or a new document, and you're putting it together and read the docs, you want to be able to take a look at how the finished product looks, rather than waiting for the build system to do that for you. So having the ability to do a local build of documentation, I think is very helpful.
So you used a couple of really good words in there. So the tool, is it the tool chain?
Yeah. Whatever your build process is for your documentation, projects should be able to build their own documentation locally, so they can see can see what it's going to look like before they commit it. Just like you would test your own software out, test your code out before you committed it.
Right.
Similar idea.
Yeah. I'm curious what Gergely, if he's still with us, if Gergely, what you know, we talk about this all the time, Gergely. I mean, what thoughts do you have right now in regard to what David just said?
Well, before Gergely chimes in, if we're waiting on him, I just wanted to piggyback on what David said, that's what he said about adding the documentation earlier in the process of having checkpoints is a real value add. I know in the when anytime I've had to write a SOP, it was better for me to write it as I was going through the process, because sometimes things are second nature to you and you might skip steps when you go back and try to do the documentation. But if you're
Right.
doing it while in the process, you're catching everything. And I wonder if that's some of the challenges that folks ran into when they talked about documentation and trying to go from one release to another. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would like to touch on the quality of docs and the checkpoints. That kind of feeds into the previous point of having waterfall versus agile development, because checkpoints and more checkpoints is waterfall by definition. And well, quality of docs patches should be welcome every time.
Say that last part again, Robert.
Patches to improve quality of docs should be welcome at any time in the release process.
Okay, so the improvement of docs.
I would even say that they should be more welcome than code changes, because those require docs changes usually.
Right, yeah. Improvement of docs should be an all the time practice. Almost like a CI, continuous improvement. There should be a continuous improvement process associated with docs. Okay.
Shouldn't docs be submitted with changes that are actually causing needs for doc changes? So if you're contributing code that brings in a modification to the doc that would mean that the docs should be modified, shouldn't you actually be requiring the docs come in with those changes?
I think yes. I think for those kind of documentation which like grows together with the code, it should be handled in the same change set. But there are documents which are independent from the code, like whatever, like the contributors guide, or like most of Anuket. These are separate documents from like their life cycle, evolution point of view than the code.
So we're just going to basically say it's, one of the things we should adopt as a community is if there's a change in a code or a specification that's going to be implemented, the documentation has to be submitted when that change is made. In other words,
when it's, well, it should be part of review, because remember, this is placing more hurdles on the contributor. So, and those people may not even be aware of that there is a bit of documentation referencing that code. So it should be part of review, really.
Part of the review process.
Yeah.
And
that
if
also
possible, it should be automated.
Yeah, that speaks to documentation that should be automated as much as possible, so it can just pull out doc strings and such.
Should be automated. Okay.
But there again, with automation, you need to be careful when you're automating it that you don't set up a situation that makes it, impossible or difficult for people to do a local, build of the documentation.
So trying to figure out how to say that, David.
Well, CI automation should not preclude local build.
Agree.
Okay.
You can always do take care of that by essentially splitting the validation, because one is rendering and presenting it to the contributor locally, and then obviously you can have two-part validation on the CI.
Splitting, what was that again? Splitting the validation?
Yeah, because one part is whether the docs render and whether you can look at them locally. And the other question is, are the docs consistent with the code being changed, if I understand it correctly?
Okay. All right. Other thoughts here?
Yes, and I think that leads us to another issue, like how the building of the documentation is handled, like all these conf PIs or whatever other tools that we are using to build the documentation. Who is maintaining all of that?
Who's maintaining all of that? Is what you
Yes,
said?
and how do yes, and especially when people change in the team. So how can we ensure that there is a business continuity kind of thing for this kind of framework? And I think, in my opinion, at least, maybe we can debate this. There should be some knowledge in LFN staff about how to build our documentation to provide continuity if we lose contributors who are the only ones.
So, and we've had this conversation back and forth inside of our community, Gergely, about who has responsibility for maintaining the systems. So is it a, do we need does LFIT have the primary responsibility and the community has backup? Or does the community need to have a higher level of access so they can maintain it better? I mean, that's one of the things I think has to be addressed. And I don't know
Yes,
that we've
but I wouldn't point to LFIT specifically. I think LFIT has a separate function. It's more like LF or LF networking as an entity whose mission is to keep these projects alive.
Okay, gotcha.
So how do they achieve this?
Okay. Other things we wanted to put on the list here so far under docs build.
Hey, folks, this is Lewis. How are you?
Hey, Lewis.
Hey, so in the just a little point, but in the 5G Super Blueprint, we have this sort of standing motto, sort of document as you build, document as you code. And it's we haven't had super great success, granted, but I think it works as sort of a reminder that documents is important. So we continue to sort of stress it on, pretty much every community meeting to remind folks when we're building out a proof of concept to continuously think about documentation in the way of, jot down some notes as you're coding, as you're building. And then, well, the hope is the goal is to sort of keep it in the forefront of people's minds. It's worked in some other organizations where we built out proof of concepts. Success hasn't been super great so far, but we're working on it. But again, I think it's just a way to keep it keep it right at the forefront of people's thinking so that they know, okay, at some point, we need to do the documentation before we can call this complete. So just my 2 cents, just wanted to sort of put that in.
So your definition of done would then include that the documentation has been completed, reviewed, and accepted.
That is true. That is correct. That's our definition of done as best we can. Although, the 5G Super Blueprint is a little bit of a different animal than most of our projects, but yeah, that is how we define it. We really need to have it complete. Like, for example, like in November, we did our demo proof of concept, and then the documentation was in like final draft, and then like the next week it was done. So that's about as close as we could have gotten, and we're working on making it real time. But yeah.
Okay. How does that resonate with the rest of the members on the call? I mean, does that sound like something that your communities could do? And do you feel you should do?
I think we should have, at least in the release milestones. That's a kind of a definition of done.
Say you broke up in my headset a little bit.
I think we should have them have the documentation related requirements in the release milestone criteria.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's like, for example, for us, that's the definition of done.
Yeah. So
short answer, yes.
yes. Short answer is yes. Okay. See, release management. Okay. All right. Let's see, who can I pick on to get more information here?
Well, probably I have another point of view regarding this
Okay.
topic. So sometimes I feel like when you have too much documentation, it's very challenging to read all the documentation. So yeah, I think that we have to keep a balance. So not too much documentation that could be, an overcome task, but also having enough documentation to keep an idea what is has to be done or things like that.
All right, so defining that level of documentation, not every change in code or change in a specification has to have, or not every one of those pieces that are done require a large explanation. If it's not, well, the expression I've used, if it's not customer facing, do you need to write anything about it other than the concept and architecture? Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing is about tooling. I know that there is a lot of tools which are checking, for example, spell checks are very good. So I usually try to rely as much as possible with those kind of tools, especially to catching the most trivial things. But yeah, I know that there are others who are more advanced and the same topic.
So, and the tooling is always something that we wind up talking about in some regard, right?
Yeah.
Because not all the communities use the same set of tooling for their documentation.
Exactly.
I don't know that we want to try to address that, because I think the different communities have different ways of looking at things and they are happy with the way things are. I think over time, migrating toward a common tool within LFN might be a useful idea, but I don't think we're there yet. I think it's going to take a while before we get to that. Oh, what did I do? There we go. So tooling, I'm going to make this What tools work best for the community, individual communities? Okay. Other thoughts? Let's see here. Who can I pick on next? So I just heard you. The last conversation was Victor, right?
Yeah, that was me. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I won't call on you. Let's see.
I think that you didn't finish the number 3. You put it's inappropriate for the
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
yeah, that sentence, the sentence of the number 3. I think
Oh.
this before. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't finish it appropriate for the reader.
Yeah.
Or audience. Thank you. All right. Okay. Wonder if Timo has any thoughts. No. Okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep. Can hear you now.
Okay, good. I don't really have any additional ones over it.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, Scott, one quick comment, maybe related to what Victor just mentioned about too much documentation. I think it's important to make sure, there's an issue with documentation going stale, and
Yes.
it's not obvious what part of documentation is still relevant and which is not. So I think there needs to be a way to kind of make it clear to the reader what part of documentation is still valid and what's not.
Right. And one of the suggestions I had made last year, Rainey, was the idea of the maintenance. And I was revolving around the wiki. How long does a wiki page need to live? And how would we go about trying to maintain that material?
Yeah, it's always tricky. I mean, at some point I was trying to personally help with the OwnUp wiki, and I basically gave up because that issue was I didn't find a methodic way to figure out what part of the wiki is relevant, which is not.
Yeah. What we had suggested from that committee was the potential of having a process running in the back. If we figure out how to get a process running on Confluence that would say, hey, this set of pages is X number of X, is more than a year old and hasn't been used in 8 months. And then saying to the person who wrote that page or last modified that page, saying, is this still relevant? Kind of thing. So some kind of an aging process, and asking people to, that kind of thing.
As long as there's a human in the middle, I'm okay with it, because I haven't found a good way to fully automate it.
Aging process with a human.
It's really a difficult problem. As long as I've been dealing with wikis, in my mind, it's the core flaw of wikis is that, for long running projects, you inevitably end up with a bunch of stale pages that can be confusing to newcomers to the project.
Yeah. I do think that having some way to judge that, look at if I create a wiki page, I should be interested in where it ends up and what it's going to do, or I should potentially not create that page. But I think there's the idea of us having some form of a process that will then point out to some human, hey, look at this. Is this still really appropriate? Is a good idea. Because we all forget, we get busy, we forget, that kind of thing. So
another thing
Go ahead.
I've run into over the years is just I think we should just be like obsessive about avoiding documenting the same information in more than one place. And it seems sort of obvious, but you know, there can be all kinds of reasons where for one reason or another, it makes sense to someone to have the same information in more than one location. And the problem is that, you know, over time, you know, people forget that it's in more than one location. And so then you end up having it, you know, if there's a change, it gets updated one place, but not the other. And then people, you know, see those the same information in two places, but it's different. And it's like, what? You know, what do I do with this? Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think just being obsessive about, you know, we already have this one place, you know, reference that, don't reproduce it.
I like your expression, be obsessive.
But it's funny though, because it sounds so obvious on the surface, but when you're, you know, deep into a project working on something, it can suddenly make sense to you to do that, you know. So it happens more often than you might think.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, David. Let me see. Sean Keeney from Ericsson. John, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, I'm sorry, I've been speaking to mute. Yes, I've been I'm particularly hearing the point about maintaining documentation, having old wiki pages lying around. But given the choice between no documentation and old documentation, I'll take old documentation every day. So even if it's wrong, it's better than nothing. What we've been doing in our little bit of work in ONAP and some other projects as well is trying to arrange documentation by release. Then at least you know that if you know, the wiki pages by release, then you know, and others do this as well, it's not claiming credit for this, then at least you know that if the documentation page is filed under an old release, it's probably out of date, but if it's the best there is, then you go with it. So it
It's
naturally,
the best there is, right?
Yeah. So it naturally has a time to live, which is the length of that release. Then, you know, we try where possible to, you know, essentially clone that structure from release to release. There's disadvantages to that too, because your documentation or your wiki pages tend to get quite static and templatey and just, well, it's just a copy of last release. Oh, great. But it's at least reminds us that on a release by release basis to essentially garbage collect old pages that don't get copied over, update pages that do get copied over, and not, you know, on the old pages that are there, at least they're there. Nobody is expecting, you know, Pulitzer Prize level documentation on a wiki page, especially for old releases, but at least it's somewhere to start. I don't know, that's more of a comment than a suggestion. One other thing then is,
Go ahead.
Yeah,
sorry.
please. No. Here, I was going on to a different point. So please, if you have a comment on that.
No, I was going to say, I think it is a good suggestion because I do know that personal experience, Aniket does something very similar, is we try to store our documentation by a release or by some other categorization on the wiki, and being able to say, hey, I'm going to do some kind of structure that helps me remember to go back and look at things later and go, well, we could probably get rid of this at this point, is a good idea, no matter how you look at it. So your next point.
Yeah, the second comment then was about building documentation on the as part of the build process, essentially. So there's different languages, different tools, different environments all have different ways that you can try to do this. I know, like for instance, in Java, we try to do as much as we possibly can in Maven. Some of that then gets a bit hacky, and you end up with even it won't, you'd say the thing won't even build, but it's not. It was a documentation task that was failing, so it's a bit tricky to get that balance right. But we found that there can be a lot of diversity in the different ways that people build their documentation, and you end up having to have a heap of bits and pieces of utility stuff, some in Groovy, some in Python, some in Java, some with some obscure Maven plugin, and it really only works when they all work together. I don't really have a suggestion for how to improve that, but the one alternative would be that the fairly formal level of documentation, like we see with the the read the docs or the generating documentation from your open API files, those kind of things. Maybe some of those can actually be done as part of the upstream process in Linux Foundation. And I'd like to say, I don't really have a suggestion, but maybe an observation that sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. If we can maintain that split between what happens as part of the Jenkins jobs up in Linux Foundation and what parts happen as part of your local build process, and to consider which to use. It's the ones that happen as part of your local build process are generally going to be more delicate and more likely to fail and more likely to cause problems. With a user in a couple of years' time going, oh, well, that hacky bash script that you were using to build or to copy that file from that file to that file doesn't work on my, I don't know, Mac. Your build's broken. That's not helpful. Whereas if as much of that is done, and doesn't need to be done at every build, if as much of that is done as part of the Linux Foundation jobs, I personally find that more beneficial.
Okay.
Sorry, for a guy who had nothing to say, I've said a lot.
Well, appreciate that, John. Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to make sure people get engaged here. So how about Bob or Dave from MITRE? Any thoughts you want to share?
Okay, am I unmuted now?
You are.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any groundbreaking thoughts to share, other than we attempted to use some of the documentation when we were doing our demonstration for security call data records. And we found that it was quite complex, and we did get some help, but in the end, for our particular application, it was just too much of a heavy lift without having a little more knowledge, even though a couple of the members did take classes on the ONAP. So that's kind of my high level feedback.
Okay.
It was the complexity. So because there were little nuances that ultimately kept the thing, working the way we wanted it to, and so it was a lack of knowledge, I guess, and with the documentation not being as clear. A how-to guide, step by step, and I don't want to say this, but how-to for dummies. So for those of us who are trying to do this, for the first time or second time, where we can get a simple thing up and running without all the complexity of all the dependencies, that would be useful. However, I'm not a developer by training, so
Okay.
that's an outsider's opinion. Over.
Okay. I do, but I think it's good that you brought that out, because that's something that if we were talking about adoption and adoptability and oh, what was Gergely's expression earlier? The first session we did today. One of the things we have to consider is if someone takes the documentation to try to use it and it's really challenging to understand that, then we probably have we probably have to deal with that as a reason why somebody may not go any further with other than a precursory look. So I think it's definitely something we have to think about as we go forward. Maybe it's not appropriate in every project to have that how-to or the the guide for dummies kind of thing, but it's certainly something we might want to talk about as far as the what we produce as air quotes around product.
So one last final thought on that is once you have the documentation, give it to someone who isn't a continuous practitioner. And so, because they're gonna fumble through it and discover things that are probably obvious to the developers, but not necessarily to the adopter. Over.
Okay. Good idea. I'll say less literate.
Less experienced, yeah, maybe.
Reviewer. Okay, good. Other comments, questions? We've got about, I don't know, 12 minutes left. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said. Like, I mean, at the point where you start explaining the documentation, I think at that moment you start having a trouble. Like, I mean, yeah, when you have documentation and you have to explain anything of that documentation to new people.
Yep.
Yeah, at that point is when you're starting having problems, or like you have to do something.
Yeah. So you're just adding on, Victor, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to call it one more person here. Let me think. Who would I reach out to? I'm going to butcher the name. Ken Ashima. Okay, Ken's being shy. Andrew Gimsberg, I think you've already made comment. Andrew Lamb. Andrew, thoughts? Let's see. Okay. All right, I hate to do it. Adilko. Oh, I'm sorry, Ildiko. Anything you want to add?
Which part are you asking about right now? Sorry, I'm
Documentation.
multitasking as always.
Yeah. Anything related to documentation that we could do that we should be considering? And
I think in general, anything that you can do with visibility, that's a great effort to invest in, and also while trying to make sure that you cover everything that you feel is important, also try to have maybe periodical, like having reviews periodically to see if it's still easy enough to follow.
Okay.
Like, I don't know, ask people to check if they can find information in it.
Yep.
Because that's my most recent experience with documentation, that there are a few projects, they're putting out a lot of new content, but sometimes it's just, I wouldn't say poorly organized, it's just someone organizes it because they know what everything means and where they are. But if someone is a newcomer, then it's like, where am I supposed to go now?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think that when it comes to documentation, those are efforts that are worthwhile. Like in technical projects where you're writing like installation guides, for instance, they are often, so during the release candidate periods, it's not just the code that gets tested, but documentation as well. So there are people who actually go through the install guides and see if it's actually giving them the expected results. And while not everything is an installation guide in AnyKit, I think the approach itself could be a good one, that someone who's not familiar with the entire, set of documentation because they did not work on it the whole release cycle, but they could go through and see if they, find what they are looking for. Like, does it feel like it's easy enough to navigate for them? Just kind of brainstorming a little bit.
Yeah. No,
How
I like
to
that. Yeah.
apply approaches that work in a more technical context, because I think that documentation is hard and you can never really get it absolutely right, because everyone is coming from a different perspective.
Right.
But we
Yeah.
can still, have efforts to ensure that it did not get more chaotic than how it needs to be. And if it's easy enough to navigate for most, then it's probably also easier to contribute to it. And when it comes to just like getting feedback about how easy it is to navigate, that's also contribution. So you don't necessarily have to look for people to help out with that in the existing contributor base, but you can also ask a newcomer that, oh, hey, by the way, this is our documentation. Let us know what you think.
Yeah.
How we can improve that. And then it's either them who might be, volunteering to help fixing things, or at least you get some feedback.
Yeah.
So
You get some fresh perspectives and potentially some things that you could correct for people that are coming to look at docs that aren't as literate, aren't as familiar. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
All right. Any other comments, questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say that we can stop the recording, and we can then get an extra 6-minute break in before our next session starts. Anybody okay with that?
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks all. Appreciate your input today, and thanks again.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, everyone, we'll wait till our next session here will be Andy Grimberg. He'll get started here in just a few moments.